Hello, thanks for joining us. I'm Katrina Blowers from 7 News, and once again I'm with our resident parenting expert, Professor Matt Sanders, the Director of the Parenting and Family Support Centre at the University of Queensland. Welcome back, Matt.
Hi, Katrina.
Well, supporting families is of course what this show is all about, and previously we've looked at the issue of strong emotions within families. But for many parents, anxiety in their children, particularly at the moment, is of concern, given these unsettling times that we're in at the moment.
Absolutely. I mean, we've had some focus on how we deal with those difficult emotions ourselves, and the challenge for a lot of parents is just to gain an understanding of how their children are experiencing these situations, what it is they're worried about, how it is they express their anxiety, and that's the focus for today.
So I guess what we need to know as parents then, there's any signs that we should be looking out for extreme distress or signs of anxiety in our children right now?
Yeah, I think it's important to just put it into a little bit of context because, you know, kids have actually got good reason to be a bit worried at the moment. You know, they've had a pretty major disruption to their lives. Their regular way in which they spend their time has changed. A lot of people have been in lockdown at home. There's been home learning activities taking place. They've had disrupted peer relationships, and contacts with friends have been all disrupted in a lot of ways.
And they're probably watching more news or being exposed to more news
They are
than they
indeed,
ordinarily would.
and you know, if you think about the amount of exposure that children can get when families are tuned in all the time to the media and listening to radio and watching TV about the threats that exist in the community around COVID, it's little wonder that some children really think there is something to be tremendously worried about.
We were over in Bali for my husband's surprise birthday, and then COVID was obviously a thing, and parents and everyone calling to say, come home. So we decided to cut our holiday short, which was scary, especially with the kids. My 9-year-old, I guess we didn't realise how much it really affected her, and noticing her sleep pattern change. I wasn't too sure what was going on. I was asking her questions, she would cry, and then she would only want to go to sleep with us. How you guys going? So to comfort Vit, I guess we just made sure that we're going for afternoon walks and bike rides and just trying to play with the kids as much as possible. I think it helped a lot with all of us.
All right, so what are those warning signs that we as parents or caregivers should be looking out for in our kids?
Their response to stress can vary depending upon their age and their own level of development. But for example, some kids will come across when they're anxious as being irritable and angry. Other children can become like clingy in a way that separation becomes a problem for them. Even the parent going perhaps from one room to the next or trying to go to the loo, you can have kids who are anxious sort of tracking and following. Other signs that children can be anxious will include children wanting to spend more time on their own and they're disengaging, and other kids can have problems with attention and concentration. If this is not usual patterns of behaviour, and it seems to have been really associated with the commencement of the pandemic, then that's a bit of a clue to us as a parent that your kids are probably quite anxious.
All right, so we've spoken a bit about those subtle cues. What if your children openly express their anxiety? What should we do then?
I think the important thing there is to make sure that we're creating an opportunity for children to express their concerns, their feelings, and that we need to tune in and listen to what they're saying. And the goal really is to try to understand where they're coming from, what it is that they're actually concerned about. And sometimes children can tell us that, and sometimes they can't. But the most important thing, I think, is not to get too judgy about how the children are feeling. We should try to avoid saying things, look, you don't need to think that way, or you don't need to feel worried about that. Where our goal perhaps is to reassure the kids that there's there's no basis for their concern. But at the same time, it can be quite dismissive. It can be as though we're not listening to what the children are saying.
Because I guess as a journalist, I often try to counter-argue with some facts by saying, well, you don't need to worry because this is what the reality is right now, or it's my job to keep you safe, you don't need to worry about that. But perhaps that's not the right approach.
I think it's important to convey a message that their concern is valid and it's real to them, and that our job as a parent is try to understand where that comes from. And if it's sometimes based on misinformation, and providing more accurate information helps them to reassess the situation and figure out for themselves that is actually, I don't need to be as worried about that as I think I have been, then that's a good thing. But if you just simply dismiss the emotion that children are giving us and just say, you've got no basis for being concerned about that at all, kids feel they're not being heard. If we prescribe to them how they should or must feel in a situation, you'll often get kids feeling resentful about it and feeling not understood.
Well, after the break, we'll have some advice on how to help anxious kids handle and solve their own problems. Welcome back. Well, Matt, I know as a parent it can sometimes feel physically painful to see your child suffering from anxiety or in distress. What advice do you have of how to deal with those emotions?
I think you've put your finger on something that's really important, because parents do find it very difficult to see their kids suffering. An almost instinctive response in that situation is to want to step in, take over, protect the kids from the source of distress that they seem to be in, and in that way to try to protect them. And it's interesting that sometimes by just taking away the source of the distress for children and stepping in and taking over actually prevents children learning to manage the difficult situation or stressful situation they're encountering.
Well, I've certainly been guilty of stepping in and doing that. And joining us now to talk more about that topic is Vanessa Cobham. She's a child anxiety expert and associate professor at the University of Queensland. Welcome, Vanessa.
Hi, Katrina. Hi, Matt.
Hi, Vanessa.
Now, Vanessa, you've spent a lot of time helping kids and parents manage anxiety. Should parents be stepping in every single time to solve their children's problems and trying to protect them from ever feeling anxiety?
It's such an instinctive response for parents. It's really difficult to see your child be in distress, and you just want to solve that situation for them and alleviate that sense of distress. And so it seems absolutely counterintuitive, really, this idea that I guess we're talking about now, that solving children's problems for them is ultimately not a helpful thing to do. Each time we do this, what our kids are learning is, I need mum or dad in order to be able to deal with this situation. What they're not learning is how to solve future problems for themselves.
So, Vanessa, would you describe our role as parents then to be more like a safety net if things go wrong?
Look, I think that's a lovely description. A safety net if things go wrong. And also, I think very much a role for us as parents is to facilitate or support our kids to develop the skills to be able to solve their own problems.
And Vanessa, what would you say if there's a situation where your child is suffering from anxiety because of the way that they're seeing the world? It's their thoughts that are causing them to have anxiety. How do we help them in that situation?
Yeah, look, this is really key to helping kids deal with any sort of uncomfortable emotion, actually, whether it's anxiety or anger or sadness, whatever it might be. And it's this idea of flexible thinking that is so important. We tend to treat the thoughts that we have as facts that are true, and this isn't right. The thoughts that we have are simply theories. They may or may not be true. Often the thoughts that we have are quite inaccurate. And the reason this matters is that because the way we think about or make sense of the things that happen in our lives actually plays a huge part in determining how we then feel about those things and how we respond to the things that happen to us. As parents, we can really help our kids learn to pay attention to what they're thinking in the situations where they feel anxious or worried. And then we can help them to understand that there is always more than one way to make sense of any given situation or event. And we can practice with them in terms of developing this kind of mental flexibility. This is a great life skill for all your kids to learn. So you might work with all your kids about a hypothetical example. So imagine that we've got David who walks into the school playground and sees a group of kids from his class and they're standing around, they're laughing together. And then what, as the parent, you can do is you can say to your kids, okay, guys, let's try and come up with as many different ways as we can for David to make sense of what's going on in this situation. What could he be telling himself in his head to explain what's happening here? And some of the explanations that kids are going to come up with might be things like, so they're laughing at me, or those guys are happy to be back at school, or I wonder what the joke is that the kids are laughing at. I'm going to go up and find out. So the point is that there are lots of different ways of thinking about or making sense of any given situation. And once our kids understand this idea of flexible thinking, what it is and why it matters in terms of its impact on our feelings and the way in which we behave in response to the situations we face, then we can really encourage them to start applying this idea of flexible thinking to their own anxiety-provoking situations.
I just love this concept. Matt, how important is it in your view for parents to teach their children flexible thinking?
Oh, look, I think it's vital. The fact that you can change how you feel by changing what you're telling yourself about a given situation means that whenever you're feeling distressed, it's a terrific idea to actually try to identify what you're telling yourself about the situation of threat. There's always another way of thinking about the same situation. It's a really important life skill.
And a great strategy for adults as well.
Absolutely.
Well, when we come back, another great strategy, this time for helping your children manage their anxiety in a gradual way. You're with us on Parenting in a Pandemic, where we are talking about different ways to help our children manage anxiety during these strange times. With us is child anxiety expert Vanessa Cobham and, of course, our resident parenting expert Matt Sanders. Matt, before the break, we were talking about how often parents jump in to solve the problem for their children and how this can often be counterproductive.
It's interesting, this one, because early in life when kids cry, parents try to figure out why they're crying.
Yes.
They change their nappies, they feed them, they soothe, calm and settle. And so we've been very well trained by our children when we come to their rescue that it often leads to a calming or a settling. But as kids are maturing and they're needing to learn to cope with themselves with more challenging situations, that stepping in and taking over can be a major contributor to kids having difficulties with anxiety. And I think one of the things that often goes together with anxiety is this sort of tendency for children to avoid situations that they're having difficulty with or are afraid of. And when parents simply take away the source of the concern and not leave the child in a situation of learning how to cope with it, basically avoidance becomes the name of the game. And so they become fretful or anxious about participating in something they find challenging, that school talk that they need to do where they have to prepare for it. You know, they can get a sore tummy on the day that's their turn to have a go. One of the most important things in managing anxiety is helping children learn to confront those things that are challenging and difficult, and that's where parents have a really, really important role.
So Vanessa, we might bring you in. As a parent, there can be a real internal battle going on with emotion when you're helping your children face their fears. Is there a way that you can learn to teach them to do that, but in a gradual way?
It's one of the most important but often most difficult things that we can do to help our children manage their anxiety is actually to encourage them to face up to their fears, but in a gradual way, so that it feels like a process that is under their control and a process that is going to be manageable as opposed to totally overwhelming. So, for example, if we have a child who, after a number of weeks at home, is now highly anxious about actually leaving the house to the point where perhaps they're even refusing to leave the house. What we could encourage the parent and the child to do there is to work together to develop a fear ladder. And the idea of a fear ladder is that it consists of steps that will help the child get from where they currently are, which in our example is refusing to leave the house, to where they need to be. Which in our example might be being ready to go out, especially to school, for instance. Now, the number of steps and the amount of time spent on each step are going to depend on how significant the anxiety is, and that's going to look different from child to child and from situation to situation. We might have one child who is able to start on the step of going for a drive in the car, and then the very next day they might be ready to try the next step of going for a walk around the neighbourhood. The steps in the ladder are gradually getting harder, so that we are ultimately going to end up at our top goal of being able to leave the house and go to places that you need to be able to go, like school.
With it starting back at school, I can tell you, it was very hard. I felt like the worst mum because she was crying and saying she's not ready to go back to school. She was really scared. But then when she came home, she had the biggest grin on her face. She was so excited, telling us what she did for the day, how she's seen her friends. So that's really rewarding in that sense.
So, Vanessa, as each step on the ladder is achieved, how can we as parents reward that behaviour? How do we incentivise our children to want to take that next step?
That is absolutely crucial. So we need to be giving lots of praise to our kids, nice specific praise for their efforts. So not necessarily for how quickly they get to the top of the fear ladder. It's more about continuing to work on the fear ladder and whatever step they're up to. And you can also link a reward system to this. I'm talking about fairly straightforward, simple things that can be done at home, like getting to spend one-on-one time with a parent, or perhaps getting to choose the movie that the family watches together on a Friday night, or have your favourite home-cooked meal, perhaps getting to sit in the front seat of the car and make your older siblings sit in the back, those kind of things that kids actually find really rewarding.
My children love sitting in the front seat, so that would be a definite reward for them. Thank you so much for joining us today, Vanessa, and giving us those great practical strategies.
Oh, that's my absolute pleasure, Katrina. Thank you for having me.
Now stay with us because Matt and I will be returning after the break with more parenting in a pandemic. Welcome back. I'm with psychology professor and parenting expert Matt Sanders. And Matt, a lot to take in today for parents who are really doing their best to manage anxious children. What are some of those key takeaways we've learned today and tips that we can start putting into practice?
I think if you had to kind of do it in a snapshot, it's just try to avoid just being the rescuer, where you step in, take over and try to solve the child's problems for them, because that's not going to be helpful in the long run. We also have to manage our own emotions, so getting cranky and irritable and impatient with our kids, who are sometimes in showing us that they're anxious, they can be quite challenging and not doing as they're asked. And it's not that they're being disobedient, but they're actually anxious about the situation that they're in. So keep control of those emotions. And then remember that we're a life skills coach for our kids, so that we are powerful role models for how children can learn to confront and deal with anxiety, including identifying the things that you're telling yourself inside your head that is actually feeding your worry and anxiety, and then remembering that children can often overcome anxiety by confronting it gradually. And so the fear ladder is often a really good strategy for that.
I loved the fear ladder strategy, but I'm thinking as a busy mum, that takes time. So what advice do you have for parents who are trying to implement something that will take a bit of time?
Yeah, it's interesting, this one, because sometimes beginning a program on a weekend when you're not having the distraction of getting ready for work and doing all of the things that would otherwise get in the road, so you can have a concentrated focus on helping the child practice the skills, and the working up the fear ladder can be a good way around that. But there's no simple magic solution to this, because what you really need to be able to do is integrate the creating challenges for your children to confront the things that they find difficult with your everyday life.
And I suppose finally, is there a time when we as parents need to be reaching out for even more help? How do we know when that point is?
Look, I think if you've tried some of these ideas to put them in place in your own family with your kids and it's still not working, that the children are still distressed, there's a high level of anxiety, then that's the time to seek professional assistance. And you can go through your GP to identify who in your community has expertise in this area.
Well, some great practical tips there, and food for thought for any of us who have anxious children at home. Thank you so much, Matt.
Thanks, Katrina.
And next time, a topic that's very close to my heart, how we can all get a better night's sleep for both parents and children. Until then, remember to go online for more resources related to parenting in a pandemic. Thanks so much for your company. And until we see you next, stay safe and stay well.